betrayed by her husband after a snakebite, but a brave cowboy saved her life. The air in the sun-scorched basin was an unforgiving thing, thick with desolation, simmering tension, and the brutal indifference of the land itself. Abigail moved with a quiet resilience, her hands gathering brittle mesquite, but her eyes were fixed on the silhouette of her husband, Corbin, a man whose ambition was as vast and empty as the landscape. It took true grit just to share his shadow. She wasn't merely searching for kindling, she was searching for an escape, a single chance to flee the man who had long since hollowed out her soul. A sound drier than bone cut through the stillness. The rustle in the sagebrush wasn't the wind. A flicker of diamond-patterned scales. She froze her breath, catching in her throat. But as the fangs struck her ankle, a horrifying clarity pierced the searing pain. The venom was a mercy, because the real poison was the man watching from the ridge, who was about to leave her for dead. A rattlesnake's bite or a husband's betrayal, which venom is deadlier? Tell me in the comments below. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky beating down on the Arizona basin until the very air shimmered. It was a godless, thirsty land that promised nothing and delivered it with brutal efficiency. Each breath was a taste of dust and defeat. For Abigail, it was the taste of her marriage. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that defied the crushing heat, her hands gathering the brittle skeletons of mesquite branches. Every snap of dry wood was a small, sharp crack in the vast, oppressive silence her husband commanded. He stood by the wagon, a man carved from impatience. Corbin. His shadow fell long and sharp across the baked earth, a stain on the landscape. "Are you finished, Abigail?" His voice wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Daylight burns and you wander as if you have an eternity. The wood is brittle here." She answered her voice, even refusing to rise to the bait. "It takes time to find enough." He scoffed, a dry, grating sound. "Time, the one thing my ambition cannot afford. Your sentimentality, this slowness. It's a weight, Abigail. A weight I'm growing tired of carrying." She didn't look at him. She couldn't. To meet his eyes was to see the vast emptiness within a desert more terrifying than the one surrounding them. She knew this journey west wasn't for them. It was for him. For the gold he craved, for the status he believed was his birthright. She was just another piece of baggage heavier than most. But the real danger wasn't the man watching her with cold contempt. It was coiled and waiting in the dust. She reached for another gnarled branch, her fingers brushing against the warm, rough bark. A sound drier than bone cut through the stillness. A sound like seeds rattling in a dead gourd. It wasn't the wind. Her head snapped up. Her heart, a frantic bird, beat against the cage of her ribs. A flicker of diamond-patterned scales, a length of coiled muscle, a head like a spear point rising from the dust. She froze, a gasp trapped in her throat. There was no time to scream, no time to run, only time for the strike. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in her ankle, a fire that shot up her leg, searing through flesh and bone, stealing her breath. She cried out, stumbling backward, her hands flying to the wound. 2 small punctures, perfect and terrible, were already welling with blood. The world tilted, the brutal blue sky spinning into a nauseating blur. Corbin. He was there in an instant, but not with the panic of a loving husband. He knelt, his eyes assessing, cold and clear. He looked not at her face, but at the bite. He saw the swelling, the dark venom already beginning its deadly work. He saw a problem, an inconvenience, an anchor cut loose. "A pity," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He stood, turning back to the wagon. "Corbin, help me," she begged, her own voice sounding thin and distant as the venom began its insidious march through her veins. "The whiskey. A tourniquet." He didn't seem to hear. He was checking the water canteens, his movements efficient and sure. He secured the small pouch of gold dust he kept separate. He looked at the endless horizon, then back at her, his wife, writhing in the dust. He smiled then, and it was the cruelest thing she had ever seen. "The West demands sacrifice, my dear," he said, tipping his hat as if he were leaving a Sunday social. "You were simply never strong enough for the journey. A liability." He climbed onto the wagon, took the reins, and with a sharp flick urged the weary horse forward. He didn't look back. Abigail watched him go, disbelief warring with the fire in her leg. The dust kicked up by the wagon wheels settled on her face like a burial shroud. As her vision began to tunnel, as the hammer of the sun beat down upon her, a horrifying clarity pierced the agony. The serpent's venom was a simple, honest poison. It only wanted her life. The poison she had been living with for years, the one now leaving her to the vultures, had wanted her soul. She was left with two kinds of venom in her blood, but only one came from the snake. To see what happens when a lone cowboy stumbles upon this scene of ultimate betrayal, smash that like button for Abigail's Grit. And make sure you subscribe and ring the bell, because her fight for survival has only just begun. Miles away, where the red rock canyons bled into the sky, Jedediah moved through the world like a ghost. His silence was a fortress, his solitude a religion. 20 years he'd lived in this quiet communion with stone and sun, the company of men a half-forgotten language. His cabin was tucked into the land like a secret, a single room of weathered pine that smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the ghosts he kept for company. He tracked the buck with a patience born of long practice, his eyes reading the story of the land in broken twigs and scuffed earth. But a new story interrupted the old. A single straight line in the dust. A wagon track. Too neat for this part of the country. It spoke of haste, of a desperate flight, or a cold departure. It was wrong. Something prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Curiosity. A dangerous indulgence. He followed the track, his rifle resting easy in his arms. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. That's when he saw it. A splash of faded calico against the rust-colored dirt, a thing of impossible softness in a world of sharp edges. And then, her. She was a breath away from being a corpse already claimed by the land. The sun had blistered her skin, her lips were cracked and black, and her life was guttering like a cheap candle in a gale. He saw the wound on her ankle, a hideous blossom of black and purple, swollen and angry. A snakebite. A bad one. He knelt, his calloused fingers gently touching her forehead. She was a furnace. He should have turned back. He should have let the desert claim its own, as it always did. To interfere was to invite the world back in with all its attendant pain and sorrow. But as he looked at her face, lost in the delirium of fever, he saw another face, another bedside, another life he had failed to save. A promise made to a ghost. A promise he had broken. "Ah, hell," he whispered to the uncaring sky. He would not break another. Lifting her was like lifting a bundle of dry sticks, her fragility a shocking weight in his arms. The journey back to his cabin was a silent, desperate prayer. He moved with a grim purpose, her shallow, rattling breaths a constant reminder of the venom's deadly race against time. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft place in his harsh world. The fortress of his solitude had been breached. For the next few hours, the cabin became a crucible. Jedediah worked with a grim, focused intensity. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the shing, 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 a sharp counterpoint to her ragged breathing. He lanced the wound with the surgeon's steadiness, the dark poisoned blood, a welcome sight. He pressed a hot poultice of crushed yucca root and sage to the site, the steam rising in a bitter medicinal cloud. He forced water mixed with ground echinacea between her cracked lips, a few drops at a time. He worked without stopping, his hands gentle, his face a mask of concentration. He was in a race not just against the venom, but against a memory. The memory of another fever, another vigil that had ended in a silence too final to bear. "You ain't gonna die here," he murmured, his voice rough with disuse as he bathed her brow with a cool cloth. "Not on my watch. I've had enough quiet in this life." He spoke to her as she drifted in the endless sea of her fever, telling her stories of the canyon of the hawk that nested on the high ridge of the stubborn single flower that bloomed every spring in a crack in the rock. He filled the space with his voice, a low, steady anchor in the storm of her pain. He was not just healing her body. He was trying to call her spirit back from the brink. As the moon rose, a pale coin in the ink-black sky, the crisis came. Her body convulsed a violent, terrible shudder that shook the very cot. Her breathing stopped. The silence he knew so well rushed in cold and victorious. Jedediah's heart seized. Not again. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening, praying to a God he had long ago abandoned. For a second, there was nothing. An eternity of absolute stillness. And then, a flicker, a faint fluttering beat. Weak, thready. But there. It was there, followed by a single deep, shuddering intake of breath. The fever had broken. He had won. He had pulled her back from the edge of the grave. He slumped into his chair, the exhaustion of the ordeal hitting him like a physical blow. He had stared death in the face and made it blink. But as he watched the steady, peaceful rise and fall of her chest in the soft lamplight, he knew the truth. The snake was only the first monster. The one who had left her to its mercy was still out there, and Jedediah knew with the cold certainty of a winter dawn that that monster would be coming back. Consciousness returned not as a rush of light, but as a slow, creeping tide of sensation. The first thing Abigail knew was the texture of a rough spun blanket against her cheek. The second was the scent of pine and wood smoke, clean and sharp. The last was the silence, a deep resonant quiet that was the opposite of the screaming wind and her own dying heartbeat. She was alive. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Memory slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Corbin's face cold and dismissive, the wagon shrinking into the shimmering heat, the finality in his eyes. He had left her. He had left her to die. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her eyes flew open. She was in a small dim room, a single room built of rough-hewn logs. A fire whispered in a stone hearth. The light was soft. She tried to bolt upright to run, but her body was a leaden, useless thing. A groan of pain and weakness was all she could manage. A shadow shifted in the doorway. A man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, desperate drumbeat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a silhouette against the harsh light outside. A stranger. A captor. Every instinct, sharpened by Corbin's cruelty, screamed that she had only traded one monster for another. He took a step into the room, and she flinched, dragging her weak body back against the wall of the cot, a futile gesture of defense. He stopped instantly. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal sign of peace she no longer believed in. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed. It held no malice, only a profound weariness. "You're safe here." Safe. The word was a lie. She had thought she was safe in her marriage. He seemed to understand the wall of fear in her eyes. He didn't come closer. Instead, he moved to a small hand-carved table where a bowl of steaming broth sat. He picked it up along with a cup of water and placed them on an overturned crate near the foot of her cot, close enough for her to reach, but far enough to give her space. Then he retreated, melting back into the shadows by the door, his presence watchful but not menacing. She stared at the broth. The steam curled upwards, carrying the rich scent of rabbit and wild herbs. Her stomach coiled with a hunger so fierce it was a pain in itself. She remembered Corbin 2 nights before the snakebite tossing a piece of hardtack at her feet because she'd been too slow mending his shirt. "Eat if you've earned it," he'd sneered. This man had placed the food gently without a word and then backed away. The contrast was a sharp, confusing ache in her chest. He had saved her from the snake. But who would save her from him? Days bled into one another in a haze of sleep and hesitant wakefulness. The man, Jedediah, came and went with the quiet purpose of the sun and moon. He never pressed or never demanded anything. He would leave food and fresh water tend the fire and then disappear for hours, leaving her to the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. She began to study him from the cot. She saw the deep lines of sorrow around his eyes, the way his hands, though calloused and strong, were impossibly gentle as he mended a piece of leather. He spoke more to his horse than he did to her, his voice a low, comforting murmur she could hear from the open doorway. One afternoon she managed to sit up, her head swimming. Her ankle was wrapped in a clean bandage of torn linen. The black poison had receded, leaving behind a deep, bruised ache. She had survived. He had done this. He came in as the sun began to dip, casting long golden fingers of light across the cabin floor. He carried 2 skinned rabbits, his knife still at his belt. He stopped when he saw her sitting up, a flicker of something surprised relief in his guarded eyes. "The fever's past," was all he said. Her own voice, when it came, was a dry, ragged whisper torn from a throat raw with disuse. You saved me." He just nodded, turning to his work, giving her the gift of his back, not expecting thanks. Why, the word escaped her before she could stop it. It was the most important question in the world. Jedediah paused, his hands stilling over his task. He didn't turn around. "Found you in the dust," he said, his voice low. "Wasn't your time. The desert hadn't decided." It wasn't an answer, but somehow it was enough. That night, as she sipped the broth, he'd made its warmth seeping into her bones. She watched him by the firelight. He cleaned his rifle with a familiar, practiced ease, but there was no threat in the motion. There was only a deep, abiding loneliness. She saw it in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he stared into the flames as if seeing a world no one else could. He was not like Corbin. He was the antithesis of Corbin. Where Corbin was a void, this man was a fortress, walled off, yes, but solid. Real. She had entered this cabin a terrified creature ready to fight or flee. Now a new, fragile feeling was taking root in the barren ground of her heart. It was not yet trust. It was something far more delicate. It was curiosity. It was hope. And in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, hope was the most dangerous, most precious thing of all. The seasons in the canyon had their own quiet rhythm, a gentle breathing of sun and shadow, and Abigail learned to breathe with them. The raw terror of her survival had softened, replaced by a peace so profound it felt like a dream. She coaxed a small garden of herbs from the stubborn soil near the cabin, her hands finding a familiar purpose in the earth. Jedediah had given her a knife, and she'd carved a small, hopeful bird into the cabin's doorframe. A home. A beginning. They moved around each other in a shared, comfortable silence that held more meaning than a lifetime of Corbin's empty words. He would watch her, a look of quiet wonder in his eyes as she hummed a forgotten tune. She would watch him, marveling at the strength in his hands as he repaired a bridle, a strength he only ever used to build and to mend. The fortress of his solitude had lowered its drawbridge just for her. The broken pieces of her own heart were slowly, quietly beginning to knit themselves back together. It was a fragile, beautiful piece, and they both knew in a place deep down they refused to acknowledge that it could not last. The need for supplies finally drove Jedediah from their sanctuary. He rode towards the dusty, raucous settlement of Purgatory Point, a place he avoided like the plague itself. The noise of the town was a physical assault, shouts, tinny piano music, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer. It was a world of grasping, greedy men, a world he had long ago renounced. He traded his pelts at the mercantile. His words clipped his eyes, constantly scanning, eager to be gone. As he waited for the storekeeper to weigh out his flour and salt, Two cattlemen near the door were talking their voices loud with saloon gossip. A real gentleman that Mr. Corbin once said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Just rode in last week. Smart as a whip. Looking to buy into the freight business. Jedediah froze his hand, hovering over a sack of beans. The name struck him like a physical blow. Heard about his tragedy, the other man added, shaking his head with false sympathy. Lost his pretty wife out east of the territories. Rattler got her. Poor woman died right in his arms, he said. Man was broken up about it, something fierce. A cold, heavy knot formed in Jedediah's gut. He felt the blood drain from his face. Died in his arms. The lie was so monstrous, so complete, it was almost brilliant. Corbin wasn't just a memory. He was here. He was building a new life on the foundations of Abigail's grave. Says he's looking for a fresh start, the first man continued. A man of vision he is. Purgatory Point could use a man like that. Jedediah finished his business in a haze, his mind racing. He threw the supplies into his saddlebags and mounted his horse, riding out of town not with relief, but with a cold, rising dread. The canyons that had been his sanctuary now seemed to hold 1,000 unseen threats. Every shadow seemed to mock him. He had run from the world of men to escape the violence in his own heart, the violence that had failed to save his family. But the world had followed him. It had brought a monster to his doorstep. The ride back was a torment. How could he tell her? How could he shatter the fragile peace she had so painstakingly built? The ghost he had spent 2 decades trying to outrun was riding with him now. It had a name, and that name was Corbin. She knew the moment he rode in. She was waiting by the door, a small, hopeful smile on her face that died the instant she saw his. The silence he brought back with him was not the comfortable quiet of their canyon. It was the taut, humming silence of a snapped wire. "Jed," she asked, her voice small. "What is it? What's wrong?" He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff. He couldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't find the words. He simply looked at the bird she had carved into the door, a symbol of a freedom he now knew was an illusion. "He's there, Abigail." He finally said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "In Purgatory Point." She stared at him, not understanding. Jedediah finally forced himself to look at her to deliver the killing blow to their fragile world. Corbin. The name hung in the air between them, a poison thicker than any snake's venom. Abigail's face went white. The color drained from her world, leaving only the stark, terrible reality of that single word. He was here, her ghost, her monster. The man who had left her to die was laughing and drinking with other men, building a new life on her memory. She stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her throat. The fortress they had built against the world had just become a cage, a target. And Jedediah saw the look in her eyes, the fear, yes, but beneath it, something new, something cold and hard as iron. The gentle survivor was gone. In her place was a woman who now had something to fight for, and something to lose. The peace was a phantom, a ghost of a memory. In the days that followed Jedediah's return from Purgatory Point, the canyon's quiet no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. The air was a held breath taut with the humming dread of waiting. They spoke little. Words were useless against the coming storm. Instead, they prepared. Jedediah cleaned his guns with a grim familiarity that made Abigail's heart ache. She watched his hands, the same hands that had gently tended her wound, now moving with a cold, deadly purpose. She, in turn, stockpiled water and barricaded the small window with a loose shutter, her fear, a whetstone sharpening her resolve. They were a silent, 2-person army guarding a fortress of solitude that was about to be besieged. The riders came at dusk. Of course they came at dusk. The sky was bleeding out in visceral streaks of crimson and violet, a beautiful, brutal wound. 3 figures on horseback silhouetted against the dying light, their forms sharp and predatory. They didn't ride in boldly. They picked their way down the rocky trail with a hunter's patience, their presence sucking the last of the warmth from the air. Abigail saw them first. Her hand flew to her chest, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Jed!" She whispered the single word, a shard of ice. He was already at the door, his long-barreled rifle in his hand. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a terrible, familiar sorrow. "Stay inside. Away from the door." Corbin dismounted with the same arrogant grace she remembered a mockery of a gentleman. He was flanked by 2 hard-faced men, their hands already resting on the butts of their pistols. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin, an army arrayed against a hermit and a ghost. "Abigail, my darling," Corbin called out, his voice smooth as oiled poison dripping with false concern. "I was so terribly worried. It seems the tales of your tragic end were incomplete. End this foolish game and come outside. We can put this all behind us." Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, a solid, unmovable wall of weathered pine and iron will. He placed himself directly between Corbin and the cabin door. "She ain't going anywhere." The words were low, flat, and more final than a gunshot. Corbin's smile tightened at the edges. He looked past Jedediah, his eyes trying to pierce the shadows of the cabin. "This has nothing to do with you, old man. This is a matter between a man and his wife." That was when Abigail stepped out from behind Jedediah, moving into the twilight. Her fear was a cold fire in her veins, but she would not let Jedediah fight this battle for her. Not with words. She had found her voice in this canyon, and she would use it. "A matter between a man and his wife?" She echoed, her voice clear and ringing in the stillness, laced with a contempt that made Corbin flinch. "You mean the wife you left for the snakes and the son, the wife whose death you mourned so theatrically in town. Tell me, Corbin, which wife are you here to reclaim?" The 2 hired guns shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. This was not the frightened, silent woman their boss had described. Corbin's mask of civility shattered his face, twisting into an ugly sneer of raw fury. The game was up. "You foolish girl," he spat. "You should have done me the courtesy of dying." He nodded to his men, his voice a low, vicious command. "Take her! Kill him!" The world exploded. From Abigail's perspective on the porch, it was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The first shot was not from Jedediah, but from one of the hired guns. But Jed was already moving. He was not the slow, gentle man she knew. He was a force of nature, a blur of motion. He dove from the porch, rolling behind a rocky outcrop as a bullet splintered the wood where he had just stood. The air split with the roar of his rifle. It was an extension of his will, a deafening thunder that echoed through the canyon. One of the hired guns cried out, clutching his shoulder as he staggered back. Abigail pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart seizing with every gunshot. She saw Jed, a terrifying and magnificent stranger, using the land as his weapon. He was a phantom in the deepening twilight, firing from behind a boulder, then disappearing only to reappear 30 feet away behind a gnarled juniper tree. He knew every rock, every shadow. This was his home, his battlefield. He was fighting with the righteous fury of a man defending the only thing he had left to love. The second hired gun went down with a shot to the leg, screaming curses into the dust. The echoes of the final shot faded, leaving a silence that rang in Abigail's ears, thick with the scent of gunpowder and ozone. 2 men were down, wounded, and out of the fight. But the real monster was still standing. Corbin, his face pale with shock and rage, had drawn his own pistol and was crouched behind his horse, a cornered rat with the face of a gentleman. The battle was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The last gunshot echoed into nothing, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt louder than the violence that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Abigail stood on the porch, a statue carved from shock-watching as Jedediah rose from the shadows, his rifle held low. He was no longer the gentle hermit. He was a specter of death, his face a grim, unreadable mask in the twilight. Two men lay groaning in the dust, but the real monster was still standing. Corbin, his face a pale mask of disbelief, remained crouched behind the dead horse. The arrogance had been scoured from him, leaving behind the raw, ugly terror of a cornered animal. He held his pistol, but his hands trembled. He was a creature of words and whispers, of backroom deals and casual cruelty. He was not a creature of this, not of this final violent truth. Jedediah began walking towards him, his steps slow and deliberate. Each crunch of his boot on the gravel was a footstep of doom. Abigail saw the look in Jed's eyes, and her blood ran cold. It was the look of a man about to finish something, a man who had made a pact with the ghosts of his past. He was going to kill him. "Jed, no," she breathed, but the words were lost in the vast cold canyon. Corbin saw it too. "Abigail," he cried, his voice a pathetic, reedy thing. "Don't let him do this. This savage will hang. You'll be his accomplice. Tell him to stop." Jed raised his rifle, the finality of the movement taking Abigail's breath away. This was it, the end of the story. An eye for an eye, a death for a death. It was the law of this land, but it was not hers. Stop. The word came from her own lips, clear and strong, cutting through the tense air. Jedediah froze his back to her, a silhouette of vengeance. He turned his head slowly, his eyes questioning, filled with a dark fire. Abigail walked down the steps, her legs steady, her gaze fixed not on Jedediah, but on the pathetic, trembling man who had been her husband. She walked until she stood between them, a fragile shield of flesh and bone. "He doesn't deserve a quick death," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an unshakable authority. She was looking at Corbin, but her words were for Jed. "That is an escape. He deserves to live. He deserves to have the sun rise every morning and remember what he did in this canyon. He deserves for the world to know the man you truly are." She looked at Corbin, and for the first time she felt nothing. Not fear, not hatred. Only a vast, empty pity for the hollow thing he was. "We're not going to kill you, Corbin. We're going to give you something far worse. We're going to give you your life and all the shame that comes with it." It was the ultimate judgment. Not the hot fire of revenge, but the cold, clear dawn of justice. Jedediah stared at her for a long moment, the killing rage slowly draining from his face, replaced by a look of profound, aching respect. He lowered the rifle. The ghosts of his past settled, quieted by the strength of the woman standing before him. He had been ready to become a monster for her, but she and her grace had saved him from it. They tied him up along with his wounded men. The night was long and filled with the low moans of injured men and the even lower murmur of their own voices. Abigail tended to a fresh graze on Jedediah's arm, her touch gentle, their proximity a comfort in the aftermath of the storm. "We can't stay," he said, his voice rough as he watched her work. "His kind have money. They have long memories." "I know," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "This place, it was a shelter, a harbor. But the storm found us. It's not a home anymore." They left at first light. The rising sun set the canyon ablaze, turning the red rock to gold. They rode out, leading a single horse with Corbin and his men bound and slumped in their saddles, a grim procession of defeated evil. As they cleared the last ridge, leaving the canyon of their rebirth behind them, Abigail looked over at Jedediah. He was watching the horizon, his face turned towards the rising sun. The hard lines of sorrow were still there, but they were softer now. He looked over at her, and a small, true smile touched his lips. She smiled back. They were two solitary souls, two ghosts who had found each other in the wilderness. They didn't know what lay ahead in the next town or the town after that. The world was still a dangerous, unforgiving place, but they were no longer alone. They were riding away from the shadows, away from the men they used to be, and into the vast, uncertain, and breathtaking promise of the morning. They rode into the sunrise, leaving a story of betrayal and survival etched into the canyon walls. What do you think true justice looks like in a lawless land? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for riding along on this journey. If their story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales from the heart of the Wild West.